Okay, so let's take a few moments to settle down our mind in the present, the here and now, and then recall positive motivation that we generated earlier today and make that our reason, our motivation for being here for this review class. So let's just briefly recall what we've been doing up to now. In the previous 3 sessions, we're looking at this text called Illumination of the Thought, written by Lama Tsongkhapa. And it's a commentary to one of the great classics of the Nalanda tradition by Chandrakirti called Madhyamika or Supplement to the Middle Way. And that in turn is a commentary to another of the great classics by Nagarjuna called The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, which in turn was a commentary to the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras of the Buddha, clarifying the meaning of emptiness. So the main topic, you could say, or the main subject matter of all these texts is emptiness, but they also talk about other aspects of the Bodhisattva path, the Bodhisattva practice, such as compassion and bodhicitta and so on. And so we started going through this text from the first few verses where Chandrakirti pays homage to great compassion. So far we looked at how hearers and solitary realizers are born from Buddhas, how Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas, and how bodhisattvas are born from 3 causes, which are compassion, great compassion, non-dual wisdom, and bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment. And then he says, of those 3 causes, compassion, great compassion, is the root of the other 2. So it's really important, essential to have compassion. And then also compassion in turn gives rise to bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas give rise to Buddhas, and Buddhas give rise to hearers and solitary realizers. So all these wonderful results come about through compassion. And just before we ended last time, we were looking at how compassion, Chandrakirti explains how compassion is important in the beginning of the path, in the middle of the path, and at the end of the path. And he compared it to a harvest. In a harvest, you have the seed at the beginning, and then you have water along the way for the seed to grow into the plant. And then in the end, you have the ripening, like when the plant is fully ripened and ready to be harvested and provide food for people and so on. So Chandrakirti said compassion is like that in the path. It's important right in the beginning, like the seed that gives rise to a bodhisattva or person, I should say, before they're bodhisattva, wanting to become a bodhisattva and then wanting to become a Buddha. And then all along the way, they need compassion to keep going and not give up. Keep practicing the 6 perfections and working for Buddhahood, working for sentient beings and so on. And then even at the end, when they have reached their goal of Buddhahood, they need compassion to not just, relax and retire, but keep working for sentient beings. That was the whole point from the beginning was to help sentient beings. And I just want to share with you something from Geshe Jamba Gyatso's commentary. He sort of gave a nice explanation on how compassion is the root of the other two of these three causes. It's the root of the non-dual wisdom and the root of bodhicitta. So I'm just paraphrasing what he said, but he said, first, one generates great compassion, thinking, how wonderful if all sentient beings were free from suffering. And then one examines if this is possible. Can I actually do it? Can I actually, free all sentient beings from suffering? And while examining that, one finds that the root of all suffering, the root of the whole of samsara, cyclic existence, is the ignorance that grasps at true existence, and also the view of the transitory collection, which is a specific kind of ignorance, specifically grasping at an I, truly existing I. So you discover that's the root, and then when you examine that ignorance, you come to understand it's actually a wrong consciousness, and its referent object, this truly existing I or whatever, doesn't exist. And this ignorance can be harmed by a valid cognition. You can develop valid cognizer that overcomes this ignorance. Then this eventually leads to the wisdom of non-duality, realizing that things and non-things do not exist truly. So when you have this wisdom, you understand that the conception of true existence can be abandoned, all the other afflictions can be abandoned, and it's possible to attain liberation, and it's possible to go even further than that and abandon all the obscurations and become a Buddha, attain Buddhahood. So with that understanding, one thinks, I must attain enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. So this shows how the first thing that arises is compassion for sentient beings, and then that leads to non-dual wisdom, and that in turn leads to bodhicitta. I mean, there's other things as well along the way, other things you have to think of, but I don't know, I found that really helpful, because Chandrakirti just says that great compassion is the root of the other two, but I didn't find it so clear in his text how that actually works. So I found this explanation of Geshe Jamba Gyatso helpful. And we also learned that the bodhicitta, which Chandrakirti identified as one of the causes of a bodhisattva, is the contrived or artificial type of bodhicitta, the one that we're trying to develop by meditating on the sevenfold cause and effect method and so on. So we're trying to cultivate this contrived bodhicitta. And the more you do that again and again and again, eventually it turns into the uncontrived one. And as soon as it becomes uncontrived, that's the point at which you become an actual bodhisattva. It's actually real bodhicitta, actual bodhicitta. And you, the person who has that in their mind, is a bodhisattva. And also the wisdom that he talks about, this non-dual wisdom, is the inferential type or conceptual type rather than the direct one. So those can exist before one becomes a bodhisattva. Before becoming a bodhisattva, one can have the contrived bodhicitta and the inferential wisdom. So that's how they can be the causes of a bodhisattva. So that's what we've done up to now. Any questions? Anything unclear? Okay, there's just one paragraph left in that chapter. This is on page 21. I hope we have the same page numbers, because I seem to have a different text than you guys. And it starts with through Chandrakirti's commentary. That's where we left off. Through through Chandrakirti's commentary on the meaning of these 4 lines, that's verse 2, I think, where he's talking about mercy being like the seed and so forth. You should gain from conviction with respect to the teaching that it is necessary to train in these practices. You should think, if I wish to become a Mahayanist, my mind must first come under the influence of great compassion, and then, in dependence on this, I must generate from the depths of my heart a fully qualified altruistic mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta. Once I have done this, I must engage in the general practices of bodhisattvas, and in particular must penetrate the profound view. So Chandrakirti then is explaining what is the actual process of, becoming a Buddha. What are the steps we need to take to be a Mahayanist, a Bodhisattva, and then eventually a Buddha. So now we move on to the next chapter, chapter 3, Types of Compassion. And here the heading says, Homage to Great Compassion within differentiating its types. So previously we looked at great compassion without differentiating its types, or in other words, just general great compassion, what it is in general. So now we're going to start looking at the types, the 3 types of compassion. This section has 2 parts, homage to compassion observing sentient beings, and homage to compassion observing phenomena and the unapprehendable. So those are the 3 types of compassion. Okay, first, homage to compassion observing sentient beings. Chandrakirti says, so now we have verse 3 of the text. Homage to that compassion for transmigrating beings, powerless like a bucket traveling in a well, through initially adhering to a self, I, and then generating attachment for things, this is mine. Okay, so then Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary says, the view of the transitory collection as I generates the view of transitory collection as mine, and hence these sentient beings initially, prior to the view of the transitory, adhering to mine, adhere to the meaning of I as truly existent, that is to say, the view of the transitory, apprehending I, thinking that a self, which does not inherently exist, inherently exists. Okay, so that's said to be the root of our suffering, our being in samsara, all the problems that we have, and so on, and preventing us from getting out of samsara and reaching liberation and enlightenment. So the root, if we go down to the very bottom cause, the root cause of all of this situation is this state of mind. It's kind of a mouthful, the view of the transitory. In Tibetan, it's 2 syllables, jigta. So I got into the habit of using that term rather than this long phrase in English. Actually, jigta literally means transitory view. So we could just call it that, transitory view, as long as we understand what it means. And the word transitory refers to the aggregates. The 5 aggregates of body and mind. They are transitory. They change. They are impermanent. There's nothing anywhere in our body and mind that is permanent, that is fixed, unchanging. So what we have here is just a mass of parts, individual components, physical ones in our body, and also in our mind, all the different experiences coming and going in our mind. So every single part that makes us up is transitory, really transitory. It only lasts like a tiny fraction of a moment, and then it's gone. And the next one arises and it's gone. Right? So that's what makes us up. Just this transitory collection of physical and mental components. And this view of the transitory collection focuses on this transitory collection of body and mind, and mistakenly believes that there's a real, truly existing, inherently existing I somewhere within this. We don't really know where or how it exists. It just feels like it's there because of habit. Countless lifetimes our mind has been thinking this way, reinforcing it again and again and again and again. So it's like a really deeply rooted habit to believe in a inherently existing I. And we just keep going like that, not checking it, not investigating if it's true or not. And so it just arises kind of naturally, automatically, spontaneously. But what the Buddha discovered, and Nagarjuna, and Chandrakirti, and Lama-Tsongkhapa, all these great masters, what they discovered is that I doesn't exist. It's a total hallucination, a total fantasy. Like a rainbow or a dream or an illusion. It appears, it looks like it's there, it looks like it's real, but, if we do investigate it carefully and in the right way, we will also discover it doesn't really exist, it's not really there. But until we do that, we are still, hooked on this wrong view of the transitory collection. So the view of the transitory collection is specifically about I, about the I. Hello. And so it's a type of ignorance. It's a type of ignorance grasping at inherent existence. But of course, we also have ignorance grasping inherent existence about everything else, like everybody else, all the other people around us, and animals, insects, mosquitoes, and flies, and so on. So all other beings, we also see them as truly existing, inherently existing. And then phenomena, inanimate things as well. Computers, phones, and clothes, and food, and whatever, everything. We see everything as also inherently existing. And even Buddha, enlightenment, these high and holy beings, we also see them as inherently existing. So we see everything as inherently existing. But they particularly focus on this view of the I, the self, is inherently existing, because they say that's the real root. That's the most important one we need to work on and overcome. Also, it's the one that gives rise to our emotions, our emotional afflictions, anger and jealousy, greed, attachment, pride, and so forth. So in our everyday life, based on this sense of a real I, these other emotions come up in relation to people, in relation to situations, and so on. So that's what Chandrakirti is saying here, that sentient beings, initially adhere to a self, I, and that's the meaning of the view of the transitory collection. And then another thing that comes out of that is attachment to things. This is mine. This is my computer. This is my body. These are my clothes. This is my mala. My Dharma book. And so this is a little tricky. There's apparently a lot of discussion on what exactly constitutes this view of the transitory collection of mind. But the one that makes most sense to me, and I'm sure you've heard Venerable Children say this, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's not referring to the actual things themselves, because then that wouldn't be self-grasping of persons, that would be self-grasping of phenomena. but it's more the owner, the I who is the owner of these things. Okay, so there's a strong sense of an owner of these things. So that's the meaning of the view of the transitory collection as mine. Is that how Venerable Children explains it? Yeah. So we don't need to go into the other points of view. They get complicated. But anyway, so we have this problem. We're in this situation. Other sentient beings are as well. And of course, we do have attachment to the things we regard as mine, my things, but also that can include people. My friends, my sister, my brother, my child, my pet, my grandma, so my friends. Okay, so that mine, the ownership, the sense of owner, the owner can come up in relation to people as well, people and animals and so on. So that gets us into all kinds of trouble. Did I read that line? Subsequently, the view of the transitory apprehending mind generates attachment for the truth of the mind. It's interesting. Truth of the mind. Thinking this is mine with respect to phenomena other than the I, such as forms and eyes and so on.
Maybe you're about to go into this, but it's interesting that he says, then generating attachment for things, because grasping at mine is an ignorance, not an attachment. So is that like a play on words, or what's he?
I don't know, I'm not an accomplished scholar, but I don't think when he says generating attachment for things, this is mine, I don't think he's saying this is mine is attachment, but we do generate attachment for the things like this is my body. I mean, even a small child, even before they can start talking, they react as if this is mine, this is my toy, this is my spoon, this is my cup. Yeah, and they get quite upset or offended if another child tries to take it away from them. So, of course, there is attachment there, but attachment isn't the view of the transitory. That's another state of mind, but it arises from that. I mean, if we didn't have the sense of an inherently existing I, a truly existing I, we wouldn't have that attachment. So I think
no wonder this verse is complicated and understood differently by different schools or different assertions. I guess you could say that through initially adhering to a self-I, that actually includes grasping at I and mine.
Yeah, because they do say
that leads to afflictions.
Yeah, the view of the transitory collection, jigta, does have two varieties. I think all the schools agree on this, and Buddha himself spoke about it. It can be I or it can be mine. So we do have two versions of that mind, jigta, transitory view. So it seems like he's just saying here the first to arise is the I, the sense of I. There's a real I in here. And then when it comes to things, including our own body, our eyes and nose and so forth, then the view of the transitory of mine arises. So it's in relation to things we regard as owned by an inherently existing I. And I think that's probably why it does lead to so much discussion, because like this verse itself doesn't clearly explain what is the view of the transitory collection of mind. What is that actually? So some people say, oh, it's grasping at my body, grasping at my computer and so forth. But then others would say, but then if it's grasping at the body, grasping at the computer, that's not grasping at self. There's two divisions of self-grasping of persons and self-grasping of phenomena, meaning phenomena other than persons. So jigta has to be self-grasping of persons. It has to be grasping at a person rather than something other than a person. So if you say, well, it's grasping at my computer, then it doesn't work. It couldn't be self-grasping of person. So I think that's why there's a lot of debate and discussion. So yeah, to me it just makes more sense that the view of the transitory collection apprehending mine is related to the sense of I as an owner. The my rather than mine. The one who owns the object rather than the object.
She talked about this a little bit, the word attachment in relationship to Jigta, and he said that he was referring to this generating attachment to things, and he said, here attachment refers not to ordinary usual attachment. In this case, attachment is named after a kind of view of the transitory collection adhering to mind. And then he said, is there a difference between attachment and the view of the transitory adhering to mind? And this I transcribed, but I'm really wondering if I have it right, if he spoke right. He said, His Holiness Dalai Lama would say, he said many, many times, there's a common basis between them, just as is taught by the fifth Dalai Lama as well as Jangam Shepa. But there's some difference. We need to know this. Panchen Sonam Drapa has a little bit different, but all of them are equally good. But then later he goes on and talks about there not being a common basis between a couple of other things. So I wasn't sure if he spoke correctly there. I think he did. So basically, and then he went on into this big long thing about is this real attachment or not? Is it just labeled attachment? That's the question. And he went on to what is the object of observation in this view of the transitory collection. And then I think after that he started talking about the Heart Sutra. I don't know if I understood all that. I transcribed this because it was, even after transcribing it, I don't understand it fully. But anyway, that's what he said.
So in the beginning, he was saying some scholars say there's a common basis between attachment and the view of the transitory collection.
So he sometimes pose this as questions, like
I see.
Like he'd be asking us, "What do you think?" So he says, "Is there a difference between attachment and the view of the transitory collection adhering to mine and to I?" His Holiness the Dalai Lama would say, and he said many, many times, there's a common basis between them, just as is taught by the fifth Dalai Lama as well as Jangam Shepa. But there is some difference, and Panchasona Drapa has a little bit different, and all of them are equally good. So there's some different
it sounds
views
kind of
about
strange because normally, like in the list of the mental factors, like the 6 root delusions, 6 root afflictions, attachments is a different mental factor than ignorance. And and the view of the transitory collection actually comes under wrong views, the 6th one. So they're normally categorized as different mental factors. But maybe what he was saying was the word attachment, Chandrakirti uses the word attachment here, but maybe he's not referring to that usual kind of attachment. Maybe
that's what's clear from this.
Yeah.
He said that clearly. It's not the usual kind of attachment. You're actually referring to Jigta.
Yeah.
That was clear.
Yeah. He's
The rest
using
of
the
it
word
was-
attachment to refer to something else rather than the usual meaning of attachment. Yeah, like I don't have access to all of these different texts, and there are different points of view. I can have a look at. I'll look later at what Geshe Jambakatso says because he does sometimes bring in different points of view. I'll do that later, not now. But if I do find something, I'll bring it up next time. So, any other questions? Okay, so then he says, back to the text, Chandrakirti's homage to compassion observing sentient beings. So this is the first of the 3 kinds of compassion. Homage to compassion for transmigrators wandering powerlessly like a bucket traveling in a well. Question, in what way are transmigrators similar to a bucket in a well? Response, sentient beings are the bearers of similarity and a bucket and a well is the object of similarity, both having 6 features such as being tied. So we probably don't need to spend too much time on this because in the last course or retreat, Venerable Churan spoke quite a bit, and you probably did some meditation as well on this. But anyway, we'll read through it. Okay, so the first feature is that these worldly beings are bound very tightly by the rope of contaminated actions and afflictive emotions. So we have the image of a well, the old-fashioned kind of well, where you have, I think they call it a windlass, this kind of structure over the top of the well, and there's a rope, one end of the rope tied to the windlass, the other is tied to the bucket. So that's how the bucket goes up and down. So the bucket is tied up. It's not free. You can't just walk away and say, I quit, I don't want to do this anymore. So it's tied tightly by the rope. So the rope here represents contaminated actions, karma, and afflictive emotions. So sentient beings are bound, tied up, stuck with contaminated karma and afflictive emotions like greed, hatred, ignorance, and so forth. So we're not free. In Chandrakirti's commentary, the word "these" should be applied to the other 5 features also. The second is that the process of cyclic existence depends on being impelled by the mind, like the operator of the pulley mechanism. So there's a person who operates this mechanism, there's usually what do they call it, a crank? Like a crank, turning the crank to make the bucket go up and down. So that person is in control over the bucket going up and down. And similarly, sentient beings are under the control of the mind. Okay, so it's our mind, not a pure, enlightened mind, a liberated mind, but rather a mind that is full of polluted karma and afflictive emotions, especially ignorance. So it's our mind that's driving us through samsara, through cyclic existence, up and down. And the third is that these sentient beings ceaselessly wander in the great well of cyclic existence, from the peak of cyclic existence down to the most torturous hell. So we're always going up and down. The peak of samsara is the highest point, like the penthouse on a tall apartment building. But there's suffering there too. It's not free of suffering. That's the 4th of the 4 formless realms. So it's very long. You have a very long life. You don't have a physical body, so you don't have gross suffering. It's very peaceful, very calm. Mind always in a state of meditation. But it's not liberation, because the mind still has karma and afflictions, and eventually that life comes to an end, and then you go somewhere else. Sometimes down. So there's all these different realms, from there down to the lowest, worst of the hells. So we just keep going, life after life, up and down through these different realms of samsara. Never free, never completely free, but always stuck in this, like a well. Can't go anywhere else. The 4th feature is that these sentient beings naturally and effortlessly go downward to bad migrations and must be drawn with great exertion upward to happy transmigration. So just like the bucket, when it's going down, it's empty, and the force of gravity pulls it down. So it's really easy for the bucket to fall down to the bottom of the well. But to pull it back up again, it's full of water, and going up is harder than going down. So it takes a lot of effort to get the bucket back up again. So in a similar way, it's very easy to go to bad migrations, but to be born in good migrations in the human realm or in the Deva realms, the God realms, takes a huge amount of effort. It's almost like our minds are just naturally inclined to non-virtue, getting angry and upset and greedy and ignorance and so on. So it's just so easy to get caught up in afflictive emotions and act on them, and that in that way create negative karma. Very easy to create negative karma, which is the cause of bad rebirths. But doing virtue, creating virtue, it doesn't seem to come naturally to most sentient beings, unless they've had a lot of familiarity, like some of the. Anyway, so for most sentient beings, it takes a lot of effort, and some don't hardly create any virtue at all in their life. So anyway. It's easy to create non-virtue and go to bad rebirths, but hard to create virtue and go to good rebirths. So that's also similar to the bucket and the well. And the fifth is that they have the 3 sets of thorough afflictive emotions. I think there might be a boo-boo here. Need to check with Jeffrey. Because there's this expression, the thoroughly afflicted. The thoroughly afflicted. If you're interested to know more about this, you can find this in Meditation on Emptiness, page 201 to 212. In the great texts, the classic texts, and it probably goes back to the sutras, there's this explanation of 108 kinds of phenomena. Have you ever heard of that? 108 phenomena? And they're divided into 2 groups, the afflicted and the pure. And so the afflicted contains 53 types of phenomena. So there's 53 sometimes called thoroughly afflicted phenomena. And they include things like the 5 aggregates, but not, this of course wouldn't be the aggregates of a Buddha, because a Buddha has 5 aggregates, but it would have to be the 5 aggregates of ordinary sentient beings, and the 18 elements, and so on, but also the 12 links. The 12 links is included in the 53 phenomena of the afflicted class. So I think the word emotions, shouldn't be there, because not all of the 12 links, this is talking about the 12 links. You divide the 12 links into 3 sets. Afflictive emotions, emotions and actions and results. That way of dividing the 12 links. There's 3 afflictive emotions. What are they? Among the 12 links, 3 of the 12 links are afflictive emotions: ignorance, craving, and grasping. And then 2 actions. So link number 2 is usually called compositional action or whatever. And then becoming, link number 10. And then the other 7 are results, suffering results. Name, consciousness, name and form, and so on. So those are the suffering results. So not all of those 12 links are afflictive emotions, I think. Would you agree? Only 2 of them. 3, sorry. 3 of them. So I think the word emotion maybe shouldn't be there. And it should just say the third of 3 sets of thoroughly afflicted phenomena or something. I don't know. Anyway, maybe we can check that with Jeffrey. So anyway, sentient beings have these 3 sets of thoroughly afflicted phenomena, which refer to the 12 links. divided into 3 sets, 3 delusions, 2 actions, and 7 results, the order of which cannot be determined one pointedly. Oh yeah, here he says, the 3 sets are, 1, the afflictive emotions of ignorance, attachment, and grasping, sometimes called craving and grasping. 2, the actions of compositional action and existence. And 3, the productions of consciousness, name and form, 6 sources, contact, feeling, birth, and aging and death. So I think, maybe you can tell me if Venerable Children explain this differently. These 12, like, when we do a negative action, let's say we kill somebody, or maybe that's a bit extreme. Let's say we tell a lie. We tell a lie. Okay, so that action, if it's done in a complete way with all the 4 parts complete, becomes throwing karma. It's a cause for rebirth. Okay, so that's link number 2. It was motivated by ignorance, link number 1, and it becomes link number 2. And then that sets up the whole 12 links, which can lead to a rebirth and so on and so forth. But this could happen over a number of lifetimes. So one complete set of 12 links, it takes at least 2 lifetimes. It could be more. It could be, thousands of lifetimes in the middle. But anyway, there is this connection between all the links of one set. And while we're going through all the 12 links of one set, others are being created, while we're experiencing the results of one karmic action, we are creating more. We're creating new ones all the time. So I think what he's saying here is there's just like this constant circling of the 12 links. And no, he said there's no definite order. Because like with a circle, in a circle, you can't really say where's the beginning, where's the end. It just keeps going around and around. So perhaps because of the movement of the bucket and the well is like a circle that's going up and down again and again with a no definite order. I don't know. It's not that clear to me what this one point is. This 5th similarity between the sentient beings in samsara and the bucket and the well. But something like that. Just the basic idea is a circle doesn't have a definite beginning and an end. So sentient beings, we and other sentient beings, are just constantly going around and around through these 12 links and creating new ones all the time, even before we finished. We finished experiencing one set of 12 links, we're creating new ones all the time. Anyone have any other way of understanding that? It's more clear than all those jumbled words. So there are these factors. These factors which keep us stuck in samsara. And there's no definite order that this one starts here and ends there, but other ones come into play in the middle. Something like that. Okay, the 6th one, this is clearer. The 6th feature is that every day these sentient beings are battered by the sufferings of pain and change, and the pervasive suffering of being so conditioned as to be always ready to undergo pain. So just as the bucket, especially when it's going down and it's empty and it's probably free falling, probably falls again, hits the side of the well, gets battered as it's going down, and probably also when it's coming up, if the person isn't pulling it very well, we also get battered against the side of the well as it's coming up. So in a similar way, sentient beings, as we're going through these rounds of death and birth and death and birth again and again, we're battered by the three kinds of suffering: suffering of pain, gross suffering, the suffering of change. Even the pleasure we experience doesn't last, so it's just another kind of suffering. And then the pervasive suffering of conditioning. Just our whole being is pervaded by contaminated karma and delusions. So we're never free from that. We're never able to go beyond this state of being bound or imprisoned by karma and afflictions. So even in the highest realms of samsara, where there's no gross suffering, they're still not free from this third type of suffering. In that way, and therefore not able to get beyond samsara. Okay, so those are the six ways in which sentient beings are like a bucket in a well. And so this can be topic of meditation, a way to meditate in order to generate great compassion. Sorry. So therefore, these sentient beings do not pass beyond the state of a bucket in a well. Is that okay? Any questions? Okay, then he goes on. Here, the application of similarity by way of six features is not made merely for the sake of understanding the way that sentient beings wander in cyclic existence. Question, then what is the purpose? Response. Previously, Chandrakirti indicated that one who wishes to enter the great vehicle must initially generate great compassion, but he did not show how to generate compassion in meditation. Here, by showing the way that sentient beings wander powerlessly in cyclic existence, he indicates how to generate great compassion through meditation. By what agency do sentient beings enter into cyclic existence? By just this extremely unpeaceful, untamed mind. Where and how do they wander? From the peak of cyclic existence to the most torturous hell, without the slightest interruption in their circling. We don't get a break. No break. No holiday from samsara. By what causes and conditions do they wander? By the power of contaminated actions and afflictive emotions. They wander in bad transmigrations by the power of non-meritorious actions and afflictive emotions, and in happy transmigrations by the power of meritorious and unmoving actions and their afflictive emotions. So even when we do good actions, virtue, we create a lot of virtue, but it just becomes the cause of good rebirths. So we're still in samsara, we're still subject to all the problems of samsara, we're not free. When that virtue, the virtuous karma comes to an end, then we still have non-virtuous karma that could cause a bad rebirth. So then, to be born in bad transmigrations, the process operates automatically and without effort. But it is difficult to be born in happy transmigrations because great effort must be made to achieve their causes. The Topics of Discipline, Vinaya Vastu, says that instances of leaving either a happy or a bad transmigration and going to a bad one are as numerous as the particles of this great earth, and that instances of leaving a happy or a bad transmigration and going to a happy one are as few as the particles holding to the tip of a fingernail. Have you heard that one before? I think it's in the Lam. Yeah, they say, so when sentient beings die, when we die from one rebirth, whether we're in a good rebirth or in a bad rebirth, we die, we go to the next rebirth. So going to a bad rebirth, the number of beings who go to a bad rebirth is as numerous as all the particles of dust on the earth. But the number of beings who go to a good rebirth is as numerous as the particles of dust on the tip of a fingernail. Ooh, that's pretty scary, isn't it? Yeah, so they say the largest population is actually in the hells. And then second is hungry ghosts, third is animals. So the relatively number of beings in the human realm and the upper realms is much smaller. Whew. Whenever any of the three groups, so again we have this phrase, I think the emotions, the word emotion should be crossed out there. Whenever any of the three groups of the thoroughly afflictive and a round of dependent arising is present, the two remaining groups are also operating in other rounds of dependent arising. So if we take any of the divisions of the 12 links, while that is operating, the others of other sets of 12 links are also operating. It's not that they just go linear one at a time, but they can be interacting, many different groups at the same time. Therefore, the process is uninterrupted, and every day, like ripples in water, beings are tormented more than once by the three sufferings. Every single day, every single minute, every single second, we're never totally free from suffering, dukkha. If your mind has not been affected by thinking about the way that you yourself wander in cyclic existence, then when you think about these modes of suffering in other sentient beings, there's no way that you, as a beginner, can find their suffering unbearable. Therefore, as Chandrakirti says in his commentary on Ari Davis 400, first you should think about these in yourself and afterward meditate on them in other sentient beings. So we first need to realize we are in this situation. We are like the bucket and the well and going through all these different sufferings. So we have to get a really strong sense of that in ourselves, even though our mind probably doesn't really want to think about this. But if we don't, we won't be able to generate this great compassion for other sentient beings. That's a really important point, because I think a lot of people, when they come to Buddhism, thinking about the suffering of others, oh yes, I want to help others and so on. But if they neglect to realize their own suffering, and not just gross suffering, but suffering of change and the pervasive compounded suffering, even though it's uncomfortable to contemplate that, but we have to. Otherwise, there's no way to generate really strong, genuine compassion, the kind of compassion we need to then generate bodhicitta and follow the Mahayana path. Question. Can great compassion be induced merely by meditating on the way that other sentient beings are tortured in cyclic existence, by suffering, and by the sources of suffering, or is another aid needed? Response. In the world, when suffering is seen in an enemy, not only is it not unbearable, but you delight in it. When a person who has neither helped nor harmed you is seen to suffer, you will in most cases pay no attention to that person. These reactions are due to not having a sense of pleasantness with respect to these persons. So, is it enough just to contemplate suffering in order to generate great compassion? So Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, no, you need more than just contemplating suffering, because your mind might still be under the influence of this bias, this partiality, where you find it easy to feel compassion for your friends, your family, your pets, the ones who are dear to you. But when it comes to enemies, those are really annoying people and other kinds of beings, or just neutral, people we have no connection with at all, we probably won't be able to feel compassion for them, and we might even feel the opposite. We might even be happy when our enemies are suffering. So, it says, when you see friends suffer, it is unbearable in the sense that you feel to do something about it. And the degree of unbearability is just as great as your sense of pleasantness towards them. So he's saying with friends, loved ones, there's this sense of pleasantness. They appear pleasant to us. We have I don't know how to say that. Affection, we say affection. We feel affectionate towards them. They appear in a pleasant way. So because of that feeling, it's easy to find their suffering unbearable and thus feel compassion for them. Therefore, it is an important essential that you must generate a sense of strong cherishing and affection for sentient beings. Okay, so it's not enough just to meditate on how others are suffering. That won't be enough to generate compassion. We also need to generate what, I guess we could say, loving kindness, cherishing others, affection for others. And then he goes on to say how to do that. Among the monarchs of scholars, there are two systems concerning the means for generating a sense of pleasantness. Of the first, Chandrakirti says in his commentary to Aryadeva's 400 that if sentient beings are considered to have been friends, such as parents, from beginningless time, then one can bear to plunge into cyclic existence for their sake. So that's referring to the sevenfold, is that what it's called? Sevenfold cause and effect method for generating bodhicitta, where you first meditate on equanimity, which isn't one of the seven, but then thinking of all sentient beings as one's mother, thinking of their kindness, repaying their kindness, and so forth. So that method of developing bodhicitta, which is usually said to come from Asanga, isn't it? The lineage of that is from Asanga. And then the second one, he says, the great being, Chandragoman, and the monarch of scholars, Kamalashila, also presented it in this way. Okay, so that's still the first one. So Chandragoman and Kamalashila also explained that way of generating bodhicitta. The second is the system of the glorious Shantideva. So that's referring to the other method of generating bodhicitta, which is called equalizing and exchanging self and others. That has 5 points. Do you remember what they are? Equalizing self and others. Disadvantages of self-cherishing, advantages of cherishing. The fourth one? 5. Actual exchanging, which means I'm going to stop being selfish and cherish others more. And then the 5th is Tonglen. Yeah, so that's where Tonglen originates from. These can be known from my explanations elsewhere, such as the great and medium length expositions of the stages and paths. So the Lam Rim, the middle length, and the great Lam Rims explain those methods in detail. Okay, so we need to meditate on more than just the suffering of sentient beings to really generate this great compassion for them and this determination to help them. Those who strive to train in great compassion through strongly cherishing sentient beings and reflecting on the ways in which those beings are tortured in cyclic existence make meaningful Chandrakirti's uncommon expression of worship. Those who otherwise claim to be skilled in this are like prattling parrots. So we just talk about blah, 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 compassion, 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 but if you're not actually, doing the right things, the right kind of meditations to generate in your mind these states of mind, then you're just, it's just coming from your mouth, but not real. This analogy applies to other situations as well. Later, 26, I guess, maybe 26, I will explain how this comes to be called compassion observing sentient beings. Okay, so that's the first type of compassion. Should we start the next one a little bit? So the next section is homage to compassion observing phenomena and the unapprehendable. So these are sort of explained together. In my text, I have this verse here that says, though the perfect Buddhas do not appear and hearers also have disappeared. Do you have that in yours? I wonder why that's there. It doesn't seem to fit. Because it's not in the book. It's not in this book. And this is supposed to be a more updated version of it, but I just can't see how that one fits in there. So maybe we just skip it. I can't see how it relates to this topic. Okay, then he says, in order to illuminate compassion observing phenomena and compassion observing the unapprehendable from the viewpoints of the objects observed, Chandrakirti says in his root text, now we have verse 4, homage to that compassion for transmigrators, seen as evanescent and empty of inherent existence, like a moon in rippling water. So that both of those two types of compassion, 2 and 3, are contained in that verse. But we'll still look at them separately. So the compassion number 2 is called compassion observing phenomena. Chandrakirti's homage to compassion observing phenomena is homage to compassion viewing transmigrators as evanescent or momentarily disintegrating, like a moon in water stirred by breeze. His homage to compassion observing the unapprehendable is homage to compassion viewing transmigrators as empty of inherent existence, though they appear to exist inherently, like the reflection of a moon in water. In commenting on this, Chandrakirti says, homage to that compassion, omitting for transmigrators. But his thought is that transmigrators in the stanza are included as the objects observed by the latter two compassions. I don't know, that's just a technical point. Maybe he left out some syllables to make it all the right number of syllables in the verse. Anyway, an image of the moon appears in a portion of very clear water that is covered by ripples from a mild breeze. The water that serves as the basic object is actually apprehended prior to the reflection, but the reflection is manifestly apprehended as a real moon that disappears each day. I don't really understand what that means, but anyway. The excellent ones, namely beings who are skilled in these ways, see momentary impermanence and the emptiness of the nature of the moon as it appears to be. As in the example, bodhisattvas who have come under the influence of compassion also see sentient beings in an ocean, the view of the transitory, which is filled by a vast blue river of ignorance. They see that this ocean in which sentient beings abide is stirred by the winds of improper thought, and that the reflections of the being's own wholesome and unwholesome actions, which are like the moon in the sky, are reflected in front of them. Bodhisattvas see sentient beings with the suffering of composition, momentary disintegration, descending on them, and they see beings as empty of inherent existence, and, as explained earlier, their great compassion arises from reflecting on the pleasantness of sentient beings and on the ways in which they wander in cyclic existence. So actually, I've read this again and again and again, and it's not that clear. So, okay, so let's first look at compassion number 2, which is called compassion observing phenomena. And so this kind of compassion observes sentient beings, and it's compassion, so that means it wishes sentient beings to be free of suffering. But it has this additional element of understanding that sentient beings are impermanent. They disintegrate momentarily. So it's subtle impermanence. So this kind of compassion would only be in the mind of somebody who has realized subtle impermanence, who has gained that realization that things, all conditioned things, all compounded things disintegrate every moment. None of these things is impermanent. So someone who's realized that, then when they look at sentient beings and feel compassion for their suffering, wishing them to be free of suffering, their mind is influenced by this realization of impermanence. So they see sentient beings as momentarily changing, momentarily disintegrating. So it has this sort of additional element that the first type of compassion is just seeing sentient beings, seeing that they suffer, and wanting them to be free of suffering, wanting to help them be free of suffering. But it doesn't have that awareness of impermanence, that sentient beings are impermanent. So this one does. The second kind of compassion does. And then this image Chandrakirti is describing here is there's a lake, and it's nighttime, so the moon is full moon in the sky, and there's a reflection of the moon on the surface of the lake, but there's a breeze. So the surface of the lake is stirred, the water's rippling, and so the reflection of the moon is also rippling, moving, not fixed. And so this moon, reflection of the moon moving and rippling, represents sentient beings seen as impermanent, as momentarily changing, evanescent. It's the word that Jeffrey uses here. Evanescent means like quickly disappearing. So the second type of compassion sees sentient beings like that, rippling like the reflection of the moon in a lake, and has compassion for them, wishing them to be free of suffering. That makes sense? But I think this comes a bit later in the text, but I'll just explain it now. Simultaneous with the realization of subtle impermanence, one realizes implicitly that there's no permanent, partless, independent, sentient being. So that's the kind of being or person that some non-Buddhist schools believe in and actually teach. And they say that persons, sentient beings, oneself, others, and so on, have this like a soul, an Atman, permanent and unitary and independently existing. Okay, so there's many people in the world who believe that. But when somebody realizes subtle impermanence, they realize, every part of our body and mind is changing, nothing is fixed, nothing is permanent. He says, implicitly, you realize there's no permanent, partless, independent, sentient being. That makes sense? So that view is, if you ever had such a view in your mind, that view is thrown out. It's overcome. And you realize that a sentient being is just imputed to a collection of aggregates, body and mind. I'm reading my notes here. I'm not reading the text, so don't This is just a kind of summary of the main points. So when you realize subtle impermanence, by the way, or implicitly, you realize, there's no permanent sentient being. No permanent, partless, independent sentient being, and instead a sentient being is just labeled onto the aggregates, this collection of impermanent, transitory, mental and physical phenomena, mere phenomena. And that's why this type of compassion is called compassion observing phenomena, because phenomena here refers to the aggregates, which are the basis for imputing sentient being. So this is compassion observing mere aggregates, which are the basis of imputation for sentient beings. And then it's said that later, not immediately, but later, one will also realize that there's no sentient being who is a different entity from the aggregates. Sentient beings are just designated to the aggregates, and therefore you realize that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So that's another kind of self that people believe in. And in fact, according to Lama Tsongkhapa, he says that's an innate grasping at self. It's a coarser one than grasping at an inherently existing self, but it's still something that everybody has, even animals and babies, you know. We come into this world grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And that's the kind of self that seems to be a little bit separate from the aggregates. Not totally, but just a bit separate. Like the analogy of, one analogy that's used sometimes is if you have a group of real estate agents, for example, in an office, they're all doing the same kind of work, selling real estate. But one is the boss. There's usually at least one boss who oversees the others and pays them their salary or whatever. I don't know how it works. So the boss is also a real estate agent doing the same kind of work. So he's not like totally different from them, but a little bit above, a little bit superior to the others. So they say that's the way that this kind of self appears. It's not totally separate from the aggregates. It's somewhere within the aggregates, among the aggregates, part of the aggregates, but a little bit above, a little bit superior, like a boss, like a CEO, director, the one in charge. I can see that in myself. There's a sense of there's something in there that's in charge, that's running the show, that's the boss. So that's this kind of self, self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So after realizing subtle impermanence, deepening that experience, realizing there's no permanent, independent, unitary self, one will also come to realize there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So that realization is also included in this type of compassion. Okay, so this type of compassion would also be in the mind of somebody who has that realization, the absence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Even though the view of the transitory is ignorance, Chandrakirti explains ignorance separately. Oh, yeah, I like I say, personally, I don't find this explanation so helpful. But anyway, Chandrakirti explains ignorance separately as a river flowing into the ocean of the view of the transitory, because he's referring to the ignorance inducing the view of the transitory, the apprehension of a self, a phenomena. I think what he's saying here is this body of water, which the moon is reflected in, that body of water is the view of the transitory collection. And then there's a river, I didn't mention that in the verse, but there's a river flowing into this lake, and that river represents ignorance.
What came to my mind when you first read that was, you know, how there's that verse that says, first by viewing the aggregates as inherently existent, then you view the I as inherently existent. So it's, I don't know, what came to my mind was that the river is what, you know, blends into, and it doesn't really give, well, it gives rise to the ocean. The river feeds the ocean.
Yeah, the view of the transitory collection does arise because there's this view of our aggregates, our body and mind, as being inherently existing. So that precedes and feeds, I guess we could say. I just find the explanation a little complicated in here. But anyway, maybe we could stop there for today, and next week we can go on to the third type of compassion. Any questions before we finish?
So I always wonder how it's possible to still feel compassion when you realize that sentient beings are just a collection of aggregates. How do you have compassion for form, consciousness, feeling, discrimination, miscellaneous factors? How does compassion arise in relation to these entities?
Well, I don't have that realization, so but I mean, yeah, of course, a sentient being is just made up of these aggregates, these mental and physical components changing all the time. But that doesn't mean there isn't a sentient being there. There is a sentient being there. We still say there is a person there, and it's mainly because they feel I exist. So even though they are just made up of these physical and mental components, they don't realize that. They believe I am a real person, self-sufficient, I'm real, I really exist. Okay, and they have all these mistaken views, mistaken conceptions, and afflictive emotions, and so on and so forth in their minds that cause them to suffer and increase their suffering. But they also have lots of good qualities. They have compassion, love, and wisdom, and they have the potential to be free of this and to be enlightened beings. So when you realize, I mean, again, I'm not talking from experience. I'm just trying to imagine what it would be like, to realize emptiness, the emptiness of sentient beings. It doesn't mean you totally negate the conventional existence of a sentient being. That there is a being there, a continuum of mind, mainly in different bodies, but the mind is the same from beginningless time, going into different bodies, and that mind will continue to exist up to enlightenment. One day that mind will become a Buddha, an enlightened being. So this is what you want to bring about. You want to help this being, this mind, become free of all their suffering and confusion and causes of suffering, and eventually become an enlightened being. So if you have a correct understanding of emptiness, it shouldn't negate the conventional existence of sentient beings, their experiences, their potential, and so on and so forth. Because, I mean, what I've heard is that when you do realize emptiness, it actually increases your compassion. You have even more compassion and more love and more of the sense of wishing to help them. You see so clearly how all their suffering is totally unnecessary, totally coming from ignorance, coming from confusion, and you really want to help get them out of that situation and get to a state of peace and happiness and liberation, enlightenment. So like I say, I can only imagine, not my actual experience, but they say if you do understand emptiness correctly, that is the result. And if you don't get that as a result, if you think you've understood emptiness and then it undermines your compassion and your love, then there's something wrong. You've made some mistake in your understanding of emptiness. Does that make sense?
It still doesn't connect in my mind, because once you realize that the person is basically empty of inherent existence, what is there exactly to help within that mind stream? You're just helping a collection of aggregates. It's no longer this being. That's at least how it's explained here, how you realize that the being is a collection of aggregates. So that being sort of seems to disappear. You realize it's a mere imputation. There's nothing substantial behind it. Yet
think
there are
subs-
these aggregates, and that's
Yeah.
what becomes the object of your compassion. That's what it seems
It's
like. to
mainly
me.
the mental aggregates. Yeah, we're mainly, the being is mainly the mental consciousness. That's the thing that continues life after life. But I mean, it probably is very challenging. Probably is quite challenging to not fall into a nihilistic view and then just think, oh, there's no such thing as sentient beings, so why bother? Just go and sit in the forest and meditate. Maybe that does happen to some people. And that may be why, they say it's so important for us to develop great compassion. Although, I guess, yeah, earlier it was said that sharp faculty bodhisattva develops wisdom first. Maybe not before compassion, but before bodhicitta. Yeah, before bodhicitta they develop. But you really have to have this compassion there, this strong compassion there, keep you going and not fall into nihilism. But yeah, I mean, if you end up thinking that way, I think that's a nihilistic view and not the correct view of emptiness. So hopefully the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas will be around and try to, hey, no, you made a mistake there, Get back on the path.
What you're saying makes sense to me, but there's also, it reminds me that there's kind of two steps. Like, yes, when you're in meditative equipoise and emptiness, that's all that's appearing to your mind when you're in direct realization. But then you have to come out and reestablish the conventional, the dependent arising. There's like that part of the sequence, and for me that kind of takes, like, if you fall to nihilism, you have gone to the wrong, you're in the right view, as you're saying. So there is, in thinking about the emptiness of sentient beings, if you can't just leave it at that. You have to reestablish the conventional when you're off the cushion. So you're seeing things as illusion-like, not illusions. So they're still suffering. Their aggregates are suffering. I mean, their kleshas are your aggregates, your body and mind. So for me, when I see someone who's suffering, it's not just the being that generates compassion in me. It's actually watching their anger, watching what happens with the aggregates. That to me generates compassion, not just the molecules sitting there in another form. It's like, wow, look at what is happening with this emotion in this person. These are your aggregates. So for me, those do generate compassion.
But this again brings me to a puzzle I've had for a long time where, if you meditate on subtle impermanence, then you're refuting these two coarser kinds of selflessness, right? But self, yeah. But in our, when we study the Lam Rim even, and we study the reasonings for developing our realization of emptiness, this emphasis on subtle impermanence is just not there. So I wonder why.
Yeah.
You have to go through those three sort of coarser to subtler. It's a process.
But if you look in Lamrim, even Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, you will find almost zero mention. It's mentioned. He mentions the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths and impermanence. I mean, there's a lot about gross impermanence, death and so on, but subtle impermanence, it's almost not there at all. So I wonder about that myself. And I think, the Lamrim, really, I've heard His Holiness say this, it's really a practice guide for people who've already studied the great treatises. So the Geshis, the monks and nuns, they go in the monasteries, they study 20 years or something, all these great treatises. And there's a lot about it, impermanence, and they debate about it, meditate. So they get a lot about subtle impermanence. And that's the kind of audience that the Lamrim Chenmo is designed for, although maybe the idea is they've already realized it. By the time they get to the Lamrim, they don't need more teachings on it. But yeah, it's something that's been a question in my mind. Why don't they have more teachings and more meditations on subtle impermanence, which is so essential? Because they say, you can't realize emptiness before you realize subtle impermanence. It's impossible. You have to go step by step. So why don't they talk more about that. I have that question too. And I've tried asking my teachers, but I haven't really come, good answer. Okay, we should probably stop there. Thank you.